Hello, welcome everyone. My name's Jennifer Gunn, and I'm a faculty member in the program in the history of medicine and the director of the Institute for Advanced Study. And I'm very happy to welcome you to IAS Thursday today. IAS Thursdays brings ideas, conversations, and viewpoints from a wide range of scholars to the heart of the university. It's designed for scholars from all walks of life. So to begin, at the top of today's event, I want to share that we have created an access copy document for audience use during the event. Please note that this document is not for download or circulation, and the IAS Stage Manager has placed a link to it in the Zoom chat. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that wherever you are joining us from today, we are all located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous peoples. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus is located on Dakota land, ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The Institute for Advanced Study acknowledges that this place has a complex and layered history. A land acknowledgement is one of the ways in which we work to educate the campus and community about this land and our relationships with it and with each other. The IAS is committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. To begin, I have a few announcements and then some technical instructions that go with our Zoom presentations every week. So first, there is no IAS Thursday next week, but we look forward to 2 more events with you in December. And the first will be on Thursday, December 2nd, Art and Science in the Age of Convergence with renowned composer Lei Liang. So please join us for that. Also, the IAS is hiring. We are seeking an imaginative collaborator with wide interests to join us as a program manager. And you can find full details on this job opportunity on the IAS website, in the university's HR system, and priority review of applications will begin on Monday, December 6th. So please, if you're interested, take a look and think about applying. We'd really like to have somebody dynamic. If you want to sign up for the IAS newsletter, check the chat for the link to sign up. Or send an email to ias@umn.edu. Either one works. Okay, technical instructions for the audience today. We have enabled the Zoom auto captions. To enable that option on your own computer, click on the live transcript button, commonly located on the bottom right side of the Zoom menu bar if you're on a desktop computer, or in the top right menu if you're on a mobile device. Then select Show Subtitles or View Full Transcript. We'll have time for audience questions at the end of the event. If you have questions for our speakers at any time during today's presentation, you can enter them through the Zoom question and answer feature, which is also located on the bottom on Zoom's menu bar. To introduce yourselves, share resources, or other things throughout the event, we recommend using the chat feature, also found in the Zoom menu bar. Please be sure to select all panelists and attendees when you send your message. And I just want to remind you, questions go in the Q&A box. Anything else goes in chat. You cannot, as hosts, we cannot cut and paste from chat to Q&A. Okay, we are very happy and proud to present Elizabeth Wrigley-Field's talk today as part of the IAS's Human in the Data Initiative. The University of Minnesota Human in the Data Initiative focuses on the ubiquity of big data and algorithmic decision-making in every major sector of our world. Human in the Data series events are presented by a collaboration among the IAS, DASH, the Digital Arts, Sciences, and Humanities Initiative of the Libraries, the University of Minnesota Informatics Institute, and Research Computing. We are also brainstorming ideas to expand our activities over the next year. So if you'd like to join our collaboration, please send an email to ias@umn.edu. And now, without further delay, please allow me to introduce Elizabeth Wrigley-Field. Elizabeth Wrigley-Field is an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Sociology and the Minnesota Population Center. Elizabeth joined the IAS as a faculty fellow in fall 2020. And since we were at that time in the era of Zoom, she is remembered among us not only for her intellectual contributions, but also the cool photo in her background of her dog Lyra, which we came to know and admire. She specializes in racial inequality and mortality and historical infectious disease, and co-leads with JP Leader an ongoing project on COVID-19 mortality in Minnesota. She's also a quantitative methodologist developing models designed to clarify relationships between micro and macro perspectives on demography. So take it away, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for having me. And I'm sorry to everyone here who doesn't get to see the Zoom background of my dog Lyra right now. I'm just finding the right screen to share to, which has suddenly disappeared. So sorry for the delay, but here we go. So I'm going to do two things in this talk. Two research projects that whose common link is thinking about racism and pandemics, but are otherwise very different. So first, I'm going to show you new research that I'm doing on the 1918 flu pandemic that I want to argue illustrates a general framework for thinking about inequality in pandemics, where that inequality comes from, what it can tell us. And I'm going to give just kind of high-level results on that project. I'll get as detailed as you want. You know, I'm very immersed in it right now. We're just wrapping it up. So feel very free to ask, questions from any angle at all, and that will be fun. But then I also want to shift gears and use pandemic mortality to give us a different perspective on what's been happening in our current context in the United States, not only during our current pandemic, but actually long before it as well. So first, I'm going to show results on racial disparities in flu and pneumonia mortality in US cities during the 1918 flu pandemic. And this is a project with a big team of collaborators. The one I want to highlight, Martin Eierman, leads this project with me. We're kind of two collaborative team leads, and he is a really just fantastic sociology grad student at Berkeley. So one of the big questions that is working underneath this project is, what can we learn from 1918 for today? But equally, what can't we learn? So some things about 1918 actually feel eerily familiar. For example, earlier research has found that non-pharmaceutical interventions, which is the phrase we use for things like shutting down schools and theaters, enforcing quarantines, mandating masks, all that kind of stuff we know that's not directly medical. Those kinds of things did work in the 1918 pandemic. They did reduce mortality, but they didn't reduce mortality by all that much. And the reason why they didn't have a bigger effect is actually just that no city really sustained them for long enough. And why was that? Because they met with ferocious resistance. So here's something we found in a Topeka newspaper article in an archival data project phase of this project. Both the health commissioner and the health officer have been the target during the last few months for gobs of criticism and insubordination against what was termed the autocracy they were establishing in depriving the citizens of the privilege of freedom of action, the right to mingle with flu germs. So, okay. this historical relic is maybe hard for us to relate to from our modern perspective, I know. All right, so some things maybe feel like, okay, that's more familiar than maybe we expected them to be. But there's one important fact about 1918 that is really different from today and has been very underappreciated in historical research on that pandemic. And so to back up, the 1918 flu was really distinctive for at least 3 reasons, and the first 2 are very well known. The 1918 flu was incredibly deadly, and it also had this super weird age pattern where young adults were hit very hard. So we usually think about flus as having this kind of, we sometimes call it a J-shaped age pattern, where it's the really young people and the really old people who are affected. And 1918 was more of a W, where in addition to those babies and old people, people in their 20s and 30s actually had a very high mortality from the flu. So these 2 facts are well-known kind of puzzles of this pandemic. And the third one, though, is not well known. So against a backdrop of really extreme racial inequality in all other years of this era, and I'll say more about that later on, the racial disparities in 1918 were surprisingly small. And this actually was well known at the time, as this quote makes clear. This is the prominent Black Reverend, Reverend Francis Grimke, who said, "During these terrible weeks while the epidemic raged, God has been trying in a very pronouncedly conspicuous and vigorous way to beat a little sense into the white man's head, has been trying to show him the folly of the empty conceit of his vaunted race superiority by dealing with him just as he dealt with the peoples of darker hue." And so people actually at the time understood that the white population was being hit very hard by the flu in the United States, and that was something that was unusual. And this is analyzed in a really small amount of research, which is kind of shown on the right side of the screen here. But basically, this kind of surprising racial pattern has been largely forgotten in the story of 1918. And so in this project, we started by just simply describing what happened. We gave the first description of the racial disparities in flu deaths for all US cities that collected any race-specific data. And so this graph is showing the non-white to white mortality ratio from 1910 to 1921. And there are 2 things I want you to see here. One is that these racial disparities were a lot smaller in 1918 than in all other years. And also that there was very little variation in them. So they were not only small, but they were sort of uniformly small disparities. And this happened because the 1918 flu is raising non-white mortality by a factor of 3, but urban white mortality by a factor of 5. So it's a really huge change. And these small aggregate disparities were really driven by small disparities in those crucial young adult ages where flu mortality was so surprisingly high. So essentially, this is all happening because white young adults in cities had really extremely high mortality. We want to know why this is happening. We consider a lot of different candidate explanations. By the way, I keep saying non-white. That's the form in which the data are collected. It's worth saying, though, that in cities outside just a handful of cities in the West in this era, non-white basically meant Black. So that's what we should be imagining. Okay, so when we started this project, we thought that those non-pharmaceutical interventions, so things like mask mandates, closing schools, forcing theaters to close, all that stuff, we thought that that might account for the small disparities. And this idea, to me, makes a lot of sense. Those NPIs were certainly unique to 1918. It's not something that we did in other years just to control the flu. Past research has shown that they did work. And while the public health responses that cities organized in the pandemic were typically quite racist, things like organizing whites only hospitals and clinics, which happened in cities in the North as well as the South, At the same time, by 1918, there are fairly robust networks of Black municipal reformers and health reformers who would have been able to push back against that. And we also thought that even if the cities were only really responding to the pandemic for white people, they might have actually ended up disproportionately helping the urban Black population just because its mortality would have otherwise been so high. And that's we were kind of making an analogy to this work by this economist Werner Trotkin, who studied the development of sewer systems in the South, and ends up arguing that even though cities were really racist, the sewer systems helped the Black population the most because the conditions of life that Black people were forced to live in were just so poor otherwise that they had more room for improvement in mortality. So that's the kind of thing we were imagining. And so we went to historical newspaper archives and we used those to figure out the timing and also the duration of these non-pharmaceutical interventions. We were able to date them in 52 of the cities where we had race-specific mortality data. And like other studies, we found that these NPIs generally did reduce mortality, but they did it across the board. They didn't do it any more so for non-white populations, so they had no real effect on racial disparities. The same thing we found other city traits that we thought were going to be really important, like segregation, which we measured lots of different ways. City traits like proximity to military bases and air pollution, those are both things that have been found to predict cities' overall mortality in the 1918 pandemic. But none of them seem to account for the disparities at all. So what we're exploring now and what ended up becoming the heart of this project, although it's not at all where we started, is a very different kind of explanation. The urban white and non-white populations in 1918 had very distinctive social histories. The white population was spread all over the country. It included a lot of people who were born in the US. Many of those were born in big cities and stayed in cities their whole lives. They also included many immigrants, particularly in northern and Midwestern cities. The non-white population was disproportionately Southern, and it was also disproportionately Black internal migrants. These are people who were born into deeply impoverished agricultural settings, who then migrated from there to cities, first in the South and then in the North. And once in cities, they were made by law and by violence to live in really appalling conditions. I mean, just intensely crowded and dilapidated conditions that were really like very ripe for spreading a respiratory disease around. And so that, again, this combination of rural origins, but then also having the worst that cities had to offer. That is a very particular life course history of exposure. And so we started thinking about, well, how does that affect what happens to you in the flu? And we think these distinct exposure histories offer the possibility of explaining the small disparities in 1918 through the interaction of the social history of each racial group with the natural history of the 1918 virus. So what do I actually mean by that? Well, the details of these 6 distinct social immunological hypotheses that we end up considering are complicated. I will not get into them, I promise. But the story is actually very simple. Non-white people were either more likely to have had an earlier flu exposure that was protective, or they were less likely to have had an earlier exposure that was harmful. And the details of these groups of hypotheses trade on 2 very distinctive biological features of the 1918 virus. One is that 1918 had a relatively mild spring wave before evolving to be much more virulent and having a very, very deadly fall wave in 1918, which is when almost all the deaths happened. And that means that exposure in the spring could have conferred partial immunity that would have been protective when the deadliest wave was happening. And so to the extent that non-white populations would have been much more prone to have that exposure in spring because the conditions that they lived in cities were just so bad, and it really can't be overstated just how horrible these conditions of living were. That might actually have been a source of protection ultimately. This is the only hypothesis in the existing literature about racial disparities. It was put forward by the historian Alfred Crosby, but it's never really been empirically tested before. And so we're going to do that. The other distinctive feature of the 1918 flu is that according to the best current theory about what was happening much earlier, that 1918 flu had some very distinctive similarities and differences from what we think was a flu strain that circulated back around 1890, producing a big pandemic then. This is sometimes called the Russian flu. Like every other flu or disease that's named after a country, that has no particular basis in fact. It's a prejudicial name, but you might have heard of it that way. Anyways, we'll call it the 1890 flu. But essentially the idea is that if you were a little kid in 1890 and the first flu that you were ever exposed to was this 1890 virus, then your immune system was primed to respond to flus that looked like that. And then 1918 comes along and you encounter this flu that is very different. And what happens? Your body could be flooded with an immune response that was not able to protect against the 1918 virus, that did crowd out a more effective immune response, and that also did a lot of tissue damage while it was trying to defeat this virus it was unable to defeat, potentially causing people use the phrase cytokine storms to describe how it seems like people actually died in 1918. So this hypothesis has been developed by people like the immunologist Michael Worraby and the demographer Alan Gagnon, and they developed it to explain that really weird age pattern, thinking about why is it that young adults were at such risk in 1918. It's because they would have been the right ages to have had that first flu exposure back around 1890. But we think that it might also imply that urban non-white populations, because they disproportionately grew up not in cities, but in rural areas where the flu would have been much less prevalent, we think they might have actually been relatively spared this exposure that decades later would turn out to be extremely harmful. So that's the hypothesis that we explore. And so we end up doing the best we can to, all these century later, try to empirically test these, starting with this protective spring wave idea. So the high level summary here is we find out that cities that had a worse spring wave only had lower fall mortality, so that's what we would predict. It's only true for non-white populations. It's not true for white populations. It's not true in general, in total mortality. And so maybe that's protective immunity that only really emerges when in populations that had really high levels of exposure. But it also makes us think that something different could be going on, which is more of a behavioral response, where communities who'd already experienced the virus as deadly back in the spring of 1918 would have been more likely to embrace things like social distancing. There were a lot of Black newspapers in this era. They did all talk a lot about the flu. So we think that this might actually have ended up being very protective, not through this immunological mechanism, but a more social one. That's just pure speculation on our part. That's not something we figured out any way to test. And so I'm going to say just a little bit more about the other idea that early childhood exposure back to the 1890 flu might have produced these cytokine storms in 1918 through this mechanism called immunological imprinting. And it's worth saying here that our method here is we are not going to have any particularly great test of this hypothesis. I mean, actually not even close. And so what we end up doing is trying to triangulate. So we come up with 5 things that we think all have to be true in order for 1890 imprinting to explain the small disparities in 1918. And we do the limited tests that we can do for each one of these. So the small disparities would need to be driven by cohorts who were the right age to have had their first exposure in 1890. That's true. Urban non-white populations would have had to have less exposure around 1890 than white populations. We can't directly test that. We can say that they were more likely to have come from rural backgrounds, and so we think that's plausible. It was first flu exposure around 1890 actually associated with having worse outcomes in 1918. We can't test that in individuals. We can't test that directly, but we can say that cities who had more of their populations grow up in rural areas did do better in 1918 than cities who had more of their populations coming from urban backgrounds. And so these are sort of gut checks on this hypothesis, and they all kind of pan out. And so what we end up doing in the end is just doing some simulations to test these last two things we think have to be true, which is that enough people would have had to have had a first flu exposure around 1890 for this to actually really work. And first flu exposure would have had to be sufficiently harmful that it could make white young adult mortality so high that the racial disparities are small. And so we set up these simulations that are basically exploiting assumptions in two domains. So these difference in urban residents, but also assumptions about how wide or how narrow is the range of birth cohorts that might plausibly have experienced this imprinting. And what does that imply about the exact age effects we should expect to see in 1918? And so basically, I'm just going to summarize this and say, like, the upshot is that we find that for imprinting to account for the small disparities in 1918, it had to have been an almost ubiquitous phenomenon for these young adult cohorts. So the imprinting has to be happening for, among the white urban population, almost everyone. And at first we thought, well, that seems really implausible that it would be so ubiquitous. And then we did this second stage of simulations where we asked, well, what would historical flu transmission rates have to be like to get that kind of ubiquitous cohort exposure? And actually what we got there is in line with what other historical virologists, which we're not, we're demographers, but what historical virologists have argued were likely flu transmission rates in this period of time. And so we end up with this situation where we had these 5 ways to try to knock down this hypothesis, and actually none of them worked. The hypothesis seems to be consistent with all of the assumptions we could find. This is not any great test of it, but it's sort of like the explanation that is left standing after all of the tests that we can figure out how to do. And stepping back, this hypothesis is interesting to me because it offers the possibility of a consilience between these 3 distinctive facts about 1918. So if it's all really about these early childhood exposures, then we potentially have a way to account for at least some of the extreme virulence and that weird age pattern where young adults get hit really hard and these surprisingly small racial disparities all as a package. And that's sort of intellectually appealing. That said, you know, this is really, I don't think we're going to have any kind of like knockdown or definitive answer to this question. And so what I want to close this part of the talk with is actually the framework that these arguments give us, which is that what happens in the pandemic reflects what was happening before the pandemic, but it does so mediated by the pandemic's specific biology. And to me, this is ultimately actually a cautionary tale about reading 1918 forward and assuming that there's some sort of universal path of pandemics that we're on, or that pandemics interact with social inequality and reproduce social inequality all in the same ways as each other, or for that matter, even assuming that racial group boundaries have the same meanings today that they did a century ago. They don't. And so to me, the social immunology frameworks suggests that drawing historical analogies actually requires us to be very careful and attentive to the details to understand how the particular social histories of people intersect with particular natural histories of microbes to determine what happens. So that's the 1918 part of this talk. And now I want to shift gears and give you a different perspective, which is something that actually really changed the way that I understood the 1918 flu when my co-authors James Feigenbaum and Chris Moeller and I discovered it a few years ago. This graph shows urban infectious mortality across years for whites. 1918, you can see, is almost literally off the charts. But that huge spike in mortality for whites was still less than the mortality that urban Black populations experienced every single year in that era. And this is, when James, Chris, and I first found this, we assumed we had made a mistake. We looked at the data many different ways. It turns out it's not a mistake, and it's true not only in infectious mortality, which this is showing, but in total mortality as well. White mortality during the 1918 flu was less than Black mortality was almost every single year until the 1930s. And the white population's life expectancy in 1918 was less than Black mortality was, was still higher life expectancy than the Black populations had ever been to that time. Back at the beginning, near the beginning of the recognized COVID pandemic in the United States, so back around May 2020, I started wondering whether it could possibly be true that the same thing would be true today. Racial inequality in mortality is still extreme. The best ever Black mortality and Black life expectancy in the United States, these are shown with these horizontal light blue lines here. Those levels are similar to white levels from 20 or 30 years earlier. So one way we can understand the scale of racial disparities in mortality up and through around up until right before the pandemic is that it's as though the Black population has been denied 2 or 3 decades of mortality progress. So I asked, how does that gap compare with COVID mortality? Specifically, how many excess deaths in the white population during the pandemic would it take to raise white mortality to the best ever Black levels? And I found that for white mortality in 2020 to rise to the lowest ever Black mortality would take around 400,000 excess white deaths. And for white life expectancy to fall to the best ever Black life expectancy, and the best ever is around 2014, before the opioid crisis had fully taken hold, that would take perhaps 1 million excess pandemic deaths among whites. For comparison, we don't yet have final numbers on excess deaths by race in 2020. We have a lot of partial pieces of information. We're also going to be arguing about it for a long time, I think, those of us who do demographic data. But the official COVID count puts the total COVID deaths to all races in 2020 at about 375,000. Everyone agrees those are too low. No one agrees by how much. My best guess is that we're ultimately going to settle on something like white excess mortality numbers of something like 300,000 to 350,000. And that's a lot higher than I expected when I started doing this in May of 2020, when those numbers were still, frankly, unimaginable. But nevertheless, this is telling us that even if somehow the Black population had been immune to COVID, it still would have had higher mortality in 2020 than the white population did in actuality in this deadly pandemic. When I did this project, I saw it as a way to try to denaturalize a social fact, extreme mortality disparities that we often take for granted. As a mortality demographer, my job is counting deaths. I'm very interested in seeking out metrics that try to translate deaths from statistical measures into more human measures. So for example, lately I've been trying different ways to understand what racial disparities in COVID mortality itself amounts to. So in what I just showed you, I used COVID mortality for whites as a metric for understanding how high mortality is for Black people in the United States in non-COVID times. Now I'm going to go the other way around, and I'm going to use the Black-white racial gap in mortality in non-pandemic times to help us understand something about what COVID mortality has been like. And so that means the first few numbers that I'm going to give you right now have nothing to do with COVID. So I asked, if we counterfactually assigned the Black population to have white pre-pandemic age-specific mortality rates, how many lives would be saved compared to the actual Black pre-pandemic mortality rates? So it's kind of the inverse of the previous question. And the answer I got is about 75,000 deaths, which, to put it in perspective, is just slightly larger than the number of Black people who die of cancer every year. So you could think about preventing these excess deaths that Black people have compared to white people in the United States. You could think about that as akin to if we could prevent cancer, if we could cure cancer in the Black population. You should know that this number is artificially low. It comes from using the age distribution of the Black population as it currently exists. But the Black population is very young, partly because its mortality is very high. And so that 75,000 deaths is what you would get if you had a 1-year blip of white mortality after a long period of much higher mortality. It's actually a much smaller number than you would get in a steady state low mortality scenario. But let's go with this artificially low number and say that in non-pandemic times, we're talking about 75,000 extra Black deaths per year, like if we had cured cancer. Now, how does that compare to COVID deaths? Since we still don't have our final excess mortality deaths for 2020, I'll skip over the details of how I tried to get a good race-specific number that we're still arguing about. But basically, over the whole year, we could estimate perhaps around 120,000 excess Black deaths in the Black population. In other words, more than cancer, more than all those deaths representing Black-white inequality in a typical year. And what I hope you've taken from this particular comparison is just a sense of the scale of the utter catastrophe of this pandemic, just how much death it has meant, and how unequal it has been. And so finally, I want to back up and return to that main result, that it would take 400,000 excess white deaths in any year to match Black mortality in the best year. What does this tell us? Pandemics are special because they are intimately linked to social action. So we haven't done like a fraction of what I think we should have done to stop this pandemic, to make stopping it survivable to more people, with real support for staying home, real protection for those who can't, all kinds of social programs. Let's talk about this in the Q&A, exactly what could be done, et cetera, different approaches to vaccination. But from the perspective of early 2020, it's also true that what we have done is remarkable. What stands out to me is the speed with which we changed our assumptions about what counts as a reasonable change that we could embrace to stop COVID. For me, it was about 10 days in March 2020 that immediately upended all of my assumptions about what the next 2 years of my life might be like. And I think that was some version of that was true for many, many, many of us. So it can feel astonishing how little we've done, but from the perspective of 2 years ago, it is astonishing how much we were willing to change. And to me, that poses the question, what if we were as serious about stopping deaths associated with racism as we are about stopping deaths associated with pandemics? In the last maybe 7 years, one radical response to racism has entered the mainstream of discussion. I'm talking about reparations. These proposals focus on a common lever for redressing American inequality, and that lever is wealth. So for example, Darity and Mullen offer these very detailed proposals for congressional committees to estimate the wealth that individual people lost associated with slavery and provide redress for them, while Catherine Frank argues for community land trusts to be created in compensation for land that was stolen right after the formal end of slavery. So the details are really different, but the target is the same, it's wealth. And this makes sense because there is no single greater proxy for power than wealth. African Americans were enslaved to create it. Indigenous peoples were dispossessed to take control of it. Nothing confers as much control. And so wealth has to be a centerpiece of any form of redress for racism. And yet, grappling with the magnitude of inequality in American mortality, this pandemic's worth of needless deaths every year, has made me wonder about other levers that might be needed as well. If wealth is the best single proxy for power, then I would argue that time, how much we get and how much we get to control it, might be the best single proxy for freedom. And as much as the normal operation of our society is built on stealing wealth, so is it also built on stealing time, a theft that was just as central to slavery, the theft of labor power. Today, that theft looks different. It's the loss of time to work without autonomy, scheduled unpredictably, located far from the neighborhoods where Black workers live. It is the cruelty of administrative burdens imposed on poor people to access social services. It is the staggering losses of incarceration. And amid all of these losses and all of this theft, I want to argue that this loss and this theft is also distinctive. Losing time to death is a distinctive harm because of how the meanings that we make in our lives unfold in time. Here's what I mean. Death means the loss of connections. Those are losses that reverberate for others. It means the loss of our effects on the world, the loss of our personal projects. It means losing the chance to see our loved ones and ourselves at different stages, to let our ideas unfurl in time, and to develop the synthesis of wisdom. Because we're social creatures and creatures who learn so well, aging gives us different kinds of perspectives on the world. I think it's not just a cliche to talk about aging bringing the possibility of wisdom. I think it's actually reflecting something very deep about the kinds of social organisms that we are. And so cutting all these lives short is also a huge cultural loss. And I have to confess that I always feel ambivalent saying that because I never want to distract from the fact that the biggest, most important loss is always to the person whose life was taken. But I also think it can be important to name the harm fully. These early deaths are robbing all of us of the effects that the people who died too soon should have had upon the world. The things that make for a meaningful life really get their meaning from the way they extend over our own and others' lives. So cutting a life short robs all of us of that meaning. And that means that working underneath these statistical disparities are these very human harms. Would these losses be solved by wealth-based reparations? Perhaps. I suspect that such reparations would do more to resolve these disparities than any other single policy would. But they might not solve the ways that the medical system devalues Black patients, their pain, treats them with skepticism and hostility, or the ways that the development of new drugs and surgical procedures still often rely on experimenting on more vulnerable patients to reduce the risk to everyone else. they might not satisfactorily solve the deadly consequences of environmental racism. So the way that wealth lets you buy your way out of air pollution, for example, is by letting you move. But we might all, and the right to move, this has been a fundamental aspect of civil rights struggles throughout US history. But we might also want to think about a right to stay where you are, where your family and your history are, and have that be safe. So health reparations could encompass programs like the mass expansion of medicine through training doctors and nurses of color, mass environmental cleanups, other kinds of reparations at the community level. And I'm going to leave for the Q&A kind of more discussion about what kinds of policies this means or doesn't mean. Because the thing that I want to close with is that what these questions have in common, all of the policies that might most meaningfully matter, is a radical scale of action. And more than anything, that's the approach that I hope we will embrace. Racism produces a pandemic's worth of needless death every single year. It was true a century ago, it's true today. So our tools for fighting it should be pandemic scale tools as well. Our imagination and social ambition should not be limited by how accustomed the United States is to profound racial inequality. Instead of approaching policies by asking what's realistic, we should instead simply ask what will work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. We have some questions in the chat, and I would just encourage people to enter your questions in the chat now. And I'm not going to ask them in exactly the order that they were written, because I think a couple of them are just making sure that everybody's on the same page about the definitional issues. So I'm going to combine two questions here. Who constitutes Black in these statistics? Who defines what one is? Or are you using the one drop rule? And similarly, does this data include white, Hispanic, Latinos in the overall white population? Did you consider language and Spanish-English divides? And do those who speak English as a second language die when those who speak it as a first language move in?
These are great questions because, you know, especially given that the argument I'm making around 1918 is that we have to actually think about the life course experiences of the people that we're defining into certain racial boundaries, you know, that we have to think in this more concrete way about what racial categories mean. Well, we should actually do that. So in the historical context, we're basically limited by the data that we have. And the way that mortality data were collected were, the options were white and colored, which we're now calling non-white in this project. And that population was defined to include Black and also Native American. It was not defined to include Hispanic Americans, who were actually in the data were called Mexican and were defined as white. And so in the 1918 part of the project, the divide is really this white, non-white, and then, but when we look at what that actually meant in cities, it meant a white population that was mostly of European origin, sometimes very recently, or sometimes had immigrated themselves, and a non-white population that was overwhelmingly African American. In the modern context, one of the challenges we always have is it's called a numerator denominator mismatch, but so we collect death data as just a count of who's died. And then we have population data, and to get these death rates, we have to put them together. And there's sort of some problems because when someone has died, we can't ask them, what was your race? And so we ask we ask their loved ones. And there's a lot of issues about the quality of what gets reported on death certificates. And then meanwhile, we're comparing these to population surveys where we do ask people directly, what racial groups do you identify with? So that's one thing to be aware of, is that there's a lot of like under the hood, there's a lot of kind of categorizing people where we want it to be based on people's self-identification. But with dead people, we can't do that directly. But to kind of more directly answer, in the parts of the talk where I'm just comparing white and Black, I defined both to be non-Hispanic. And I also used what are called race bridging algorithms. So for people who have more than one racial group, I basically made a statistical guess about if they had to pick one, what race would they choose? And so it's not exactly imposing a one drop rule. It's based on what's happened in other surveys where people did get to choose. And I didn't make these algorithms. They come from the National Center for Health Statistics, but they do reflect to a large degree the one drop history where most people who are multiracial in the end do end up in the Black category.
Thanks. So another question asks, does class play into the pandemic racial disparities at all? I imagine being forced to work in essential services while others stay home spreads the deaths disproportionately.
Absolutely. So I think there's two things I want to really highlight about this question. One is from my own research, one is from someone else's. So I've done a bunch of research now on COVID mortality in Minnesota. And one of the projects that I did looked at how it relates to neighborhoods. And one of the things we found is before the pandemic, white, non-white, so we have this, in this case, it's a BIPOC category. So it's basically everyone who's not non-Hispanic white. And then we have non-Hispanic white is the other category. And we found that before the pandemic, that inequality is very heavily associated with how economically deprived your neighborhood is. So if you statistically control for the economic context that people are living in, you can actually make those disparities disappear. Now, that doesn't mean that those are the only source of those disparities. It actually doesn't mean that at all. And that's a very important point, because one of the things it reflects is that the white people who end up living in economically deprived neighborhoods, often the reason why they end up in those neighborhoods is because they've had very disrupted lives in other ways that put them at higher risk of poor health, in ways that are not so true when, segregation produces all these other pathways for you to be in a very poor neighborhood. But still, that's what we find before the pandemic. In the pandemic, we found the complete opposite. The pandemic racial inequality was overwhelmingly inequality net of neighborhoods. So it's still true that poor neighborhoods had much higher COVID mortality than less poor neighborhoods, but that's no longer the kind of statistical driver of the racial inequalities. And to us, that implies that there's some other source of risk that really matters here. And personally, we didn't study this, but I think it's workplaces. I think what this is reflecting is that neighborhoods are not actually the main driver of exposure, but the way that people were brought together across neighborhoods and workplaces and then brought that home to their families was really the key. The other piece of research that I want to mention is by a demographer named Noreen Goldman at Princeton. What she did is code occupations into COVID risk. And so she looked at things like, does the occupation involve face-to-face contact with other people, being in a crowded environment, working indoors, just these kind of like intrinsic risks. And she found that the overall racial inequality in COVID doesn't seem to be happening because Black and Hispanic workers are more likely to be in intrinsically risky occupations. Actually, she found that most intrinsically risky occupations are disproportionately white. Instead, she argues that it's that we as a society, we're not as willing to embrace protection for Black and Hispanic workers in their workplaces. So we were less willing to give PPE. We were less willing to reorganize how work would occur in ways that made it less risky, and that was the real source of risk. And I think that, to me, that results is just incredibly important for thinking about not only how important workplaces are, but why.
Thank you. Are there cases in US history when public policy aimed at dramatically changing mortality outcomes for a particular when public policy aimed at dramatically changing the mortality outcomes for a particular minority group?
Yes, so we have had public policies that were, well, I'm saying yes, but actually, if the question is policies that specifically aimed to reduce racial disparities in mortality, those are not actually the policies that have tended to have always had the biggest effect. So, for example, some of the policies that we know really mattered for reducing racial disparities in mortality are things like New Deal programs in the South that sort of like dragged the South somewhat unwillingly into the modern mortality era. Those really mattered. Desegregating schools really mattered. That's obviously a consciously anti-racist policy, but health is probably not, the first thing you think of when you think about desegregating schools, but it really mattered to health. The creation of Medicare and Medicaid both really mattered. And we don't always think about those as anti-racist policies either. These are universalist social programs, but they actually were won to a large degree out of anti-racist struggle in a way that is I've only started recently kind of learning more about and has really affected the way that I think about them. And so to me, there's a kind of general lesson there, which is like, these are very different policies from each other. Like desegregating schools, that's designed to be anti-racist. Then, Medicare, that's designed to be a universal program. The New Deal was actually in many ways a racist policy, but it had these huge anti-racist consequences. And so, but what they have in common is this kind of radical scale of action. And that's part of why I land where I do about saying, to me, the place to start the discussion about how to fix this is not with the details of specific policies, but it's with the question of, well, how much are we actually willing to change?
Thank you. Another person was wondering if you studied the deaths within other historically persecuted groups, such as the queer community and the intersections with race.
I have not. Other people do. It's much harder to do. And one reason is that it's a lot easier to study things that are collected on death certificates. We have really mixed and in some ways like poor quality vital statistics in the United States. Even when things are on death certificates, the quality of them can be very poor. One of the ways in which we have this incredibly decentralized system is that every state gets to make its own system, and ultimately every county gets to make its own system for who assigns death certificates and how they have to do it and what kind of licensing is required for them. And so it's a little bit like, it's very loose who gets to decide what's written down and how good it is. No death certificate collects information about sexual orientation or sexual identity. And so the sources of information that we have on that are much more limited, and I haven't worked with it at all myself.
So another question is thinking, at a larger scale, in a sense, about the changes in the larger public health apparatus and how that with a sort of case study of the elimination of midwives. And I think we're thinking mostly about ethnic midwives in urban centers and African-American midwives in the South, leading to increases in maternal mortality, potentially leading to increases in maternal mortality. And, how this reflects other kinds of changes in the larger public health apparatus over time, and whether, the more we rely on a white power structure to provide, is this sort of exacerbating and leading to more people of color paying the price for this with their lives?
This is such an interesting question, because, I think at least one way to read this question is this is a critique of the whole framework that I'm starting from when I say, like, well, let's think about what the national policies should be, a mass expansion of healthcare, and so what gets lost when that is happening through the apparatuses that already exist. Um, so I think that question is worth thinking about deeply. One thing I think, though, is that the scale of wealth that is owed is tremendous. And I'm very concerned about what health is going to look like in the next years and decades following the pandemic. Not just because of long COVID and things like that, although it's certainly very frightening, but I'm really deeply concerned about what has happened to the health system, the level of burnout that healthcare providers are experiencing, the pace at which people are leaving those fields, and the way that that can accelerate closures of hospitals and clinics, and just making healthcare, kind of even very basic health provision, into a much scarcer commodity than most of us who've lived our lives in the United States, and certainly in the urban United States, have really ever experienced before. I'm very worried about that. And so I think that we may be in a context of like real health scarcity. And one response to that is communities organizing what they can with each other to keep people safe. And I support that. I think that's like actually a very important response. But I think the other level on which we have to fight is about, well, what's the plan to not have scarcity become something that is embraced as the new normal, but to fight for actually health abundance, programs that would build health back into rural areas, programs that would build health back into Black neighborhoods where hospitals have closed, and so on. And I think that's actually going to be a really important battleground in the next bunch of years.
So I'm taking something from one of the questions, and also your headline from the article, looking at how do we calculate the lost production of medical personnel among people of color from the impact of the Flexner report that left only 2 African-American med schools standing. And just to say, we are in institutions that are built on the bodies and wealth extracted from enslaved peoples and the land extracted from indigenous peoples. And how do we think about our own research and explanations of things like health disparities being influenced by sitting in these institutions and by funding from, a federal government that has been part of an apparatus of state violence against people of color?
That's a really great question. I mean, yeah, one of the ways I think it plays out is the tremendous pressure to ask questions that produce answers that are palatable to foundations, that would not be something that a program officer at the National Institutes of Health or the National Science Foundation would worry about being waved around in Congress. I think where I think some of these pressures, and just the kind of like day in, day out living in a society that has normalized really profound wealth inequality, and has done that in universities as much as in every other social institution. And to me, I think I see that less dramatically about the answers that we give to questions and more about what questions we ask in the first place and how much we take for granted about, our society is going to continue to operate basically the way it has. And if we're going to change anything, it's going to be tweaks around the margins, and they have to be palatable to powerful people because that's the only hope of anything actually changing. And all of that way of just like shrinking down our imaginations ever more. And that's something that I think, like, if living through a pandemic has taught us anything, I hope it teaches us that the future does not need to look like the past. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's out of our control, and we don't have the option of it looking like the past, even if we wanted it to. Um, and so, what does that mean? Do we want to just be sort of held hostage to things getting worse and worse? Or do we want to say, yeah, it's possible for things to look really different? What's a way they could be better? And kind of just not start with these blinkers on about the status quo that's not sustainable in the first place. But I don't know. I don't know if that's like a particularly satisfying answer to that question, because I don't know that I just don't think I have a better one.
Well, I think there's some questions that are hard to have answers to in a way. So here's a question that's kind of circling back again to the issue of policies to reduce mortality. And so it says, thinking about programs that have the intended or unintended impacts of reducing mortality rates of non-whites, it might be more politically acceptable to have more general programs like Social Security and other social spending programs. But what arguments and examples would you have for the increased efficacy for more specialized programs like reparations?
Yeah, this is a good question. So I don't actually want to counterpose universalist programs to more targeted ones. I think that there's contexts in which each is better. There's a lot to be said for universalist policies, including the fact that they tend to be much more politically durable, um, because they are experienced as entitlements of everyone instead of something special for a particular group. There's other reasons to really prefer universalist policies in a lot of contexts as well. So for example, every time we impose administrative burdens on policies to try to make sure that only the most deserving people really get them, we end up cutting out huge numbers of really deserving people who are exactly the people who should have been getting them, because actually having a more difficult life makes it harder to prove that you meet whatever is the bureaucratic requirement. So there's a lot of reasons that I think a general social presumption should be it's better to create entitlements for everyone. And then there's also contexts where there's a genuine scarcity. And that's where I think things are a little different. So an example of a genuine scarcity is the early vaccine rollout, when there just wasn't enough. And that's not a manufactured scarcity the way that we often have with the idea like, oh, there's just not enough money, things are too expensive. There just truly was a physical constraint on the amount of vaccine that existed early on, even in the United States, even as we sort of hoarded the vaccines of the world. And so then who should get them? So some work that I've done about the early vaccine allocation argues that Minnesota and many other states did it largely by age, just going oldest to youngest. And it seems like that makes sense. Old people are at much more risk for COVID, all else equal. We actually argue that those ended up in practice prioritizing lower risk white people above higher risk people of color, because people of color had high COVID mortality at much younger ages than white people in Minnesota. And so, for example, here we said on January 13th, I think, that if you're age 65 on up, you should be eligible for a COVID vaccine right away because of your age. But we found that people of color in Minnesota as young as 50 had higher COVID mortality than that state 65 plus COVID line. And so, but they had to wait 3 months longer to be eligible. That to me is an example of where you need a targeted program because it has to reflect the reality that there's a targeted risk and that race was so deeply predictive of COVID mortality that no other proxy, and we looked at different economic proxies, but there's no other way to so effectively target who's at risk with this scarce supply. So that's kind of a long answer, but I hope that what is coming across there is that I think one of the big things to think about is, do we have to have a scarcity in this? If we don't, make it for everyone. If it's unavoidable though, then we should be willing to like actually be honest about what the lines of risk are.
Thanks. So another question asks, does your research at all speak to past or present eugenic forms of societal health or risk evaluation analyses and their disproportionate impact on disabled Black people?
That's a really good and interesting question. This is not something that I have done research on directly. I guess one thing that you might think is that, you know, just presenting death rates by themselves, like we know in many contexts, just presenting the facts about inequality are open to many different interpretations. And so often presenting facts about racial inequality, the facts are open to very racist interpretation as well as anti-racist ones. And so I think the point that that can be true about mortality statistics as well is a point that is well taken. And I think that the counter to me is that the starting point for discussions about mortality has to be the value of everybody and the kind of intrinsic value that we put on everybody's lives that is not reducible to, you know, certainly not to economic contributions, but really is not reducible to anything instrumental, right? But is just a value of human beings. And so one of the things that I think as the mortality demographer, where like my job is literally just counting deaths, it's actually very easy to lose sight of that because the numbers are so abstract and so dry. And I think that's why it's been of great interest to me to try to figure out like, how do I constantly translate that back into a kind of human level? But, you know, like how successful is that really? You know, I don't know. But I guess that's how, that's what your question makes me think about.
So we've had some other questions, which I'm going to basically open up so that the audience can read them, because sometimes they are providing useful information, but not necessarily asking a question or a question that might not be in your wheelhouse, so to speak. But one of the questions I think is just, in a way, it talks to your historical interest in 1918. And it asks, why have we forgotten about the plagues that occurred during the time of the 19th century treaties and, you know, that were part of the theft of indigenous land in the 19th century. And I wondered, in looking at the, you know, sort of history of pandemics and epidemics, whether you had any thoughts on this.
Yeah, I wish that this is something that I knew more about. My own research life has been really centered around using government statistics. And that's pretty typical for a mortality researcher. Deaths are one of the first things that states start counting. European states started counting them with ascribed causes of death back during the Black Death. So, you know, so half a millennium ago. And so that's tended to be like where we go for data. And one of the problems with that is it means, well, what deaths then literally don't count? Deaths that governments don't see fit to record. And that includes deaths of indigenous peoples. It includes deaths of anybody who is treated by a state as a non-entity, and many deaths in wartime as well that are often like actively covered up. So there definitely are demographers that specialize in those kinds of deaths. And like, I feel a little sorry that I'm not more in that world myself, because I think it's so important and so much the right thing to do. Yeah, I'm not sure what I have to say about that. That's actually like informative. But just maybe I'll just say that I think your question is well taken, and it's a good reminder for me to also like kind of keep front and central what are the limitations of studying something where your data comes from the state.
Yeah, that's that's an excellent point. Well, I think that we are about at the end of our time. I am seeing the brilliant and thank you comments in the Q&A. And so I just want to say thank you so much for this really interesting and thoughtful way of approaching the similarities and dissimilarities of history, and really also thinking forward about the issues you've just laid out about the future of health and our continuing peculiar American healthcare structure and system.
Thank you so much. I genuinely learned and gained a lot from this Q&A. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And thank you everyone for coming. I have a good break next week, and we will see you on December 2nd with Lei Liang and what promises to be a fascinating presentation.